I suppose you've described that what we're witnessing is a moral caste-based order, which I think you've used that terminology in your essays. I'd be interested to know why it is you think it is that women are so prominent behind these particular changes in society. Is it because they were inheritors of the ideological moral architecture from Marxism, which you just talked about there, which just sorts the world that way, and it's motivated them to fight back against oppression and to overthrow all the boundaries and the guardrails? Or do you think it's something to do with women and their relations to one another? Is there something psychological beneath it, or is it a mixture of the two?
Oh, absolutely a mixture of two, because these patterns, you get feminists who push some of these patterns who are in no sense Marxists or not beholden, at least other than extremely indirectly, to what I'm calling the dialectical faith. So there's a mixture of things going on. I mean, part of what's going on here is there are differences in patterns between men and women, right? So, and this is becoming increasingly an issue. In a situation where if you criticize men, it's feminism, and if you criticize women, it's misogyny, you can't talk in a respectful fashion about the downsides of female behaviors, which exist. Now, if you go into any schoolyard, you can see that boys, men, and tomboys form teams. Girls, women, and sissies form cliques. It's a sort of pretty standard pattern. And this generates different behavior patterns. And obviously, it's not all men on one side and all women on the other side, but disproportionately, this is how it works. And institutions have formalized teams. That's how they're structured. If they become feminized, then they become more like emotional cliques. And women, of course, very much do shaming and shunning behavior, because if you're the physically weaker sex, you can't be open about your aggression because you're the physically weaker sex. And, in evolutionary terms, typically you've got children in tow. So, you really can't be open about your aggression in the way men can. So the typical male aggression is physical, right? Physically stronger sex typically didn't have bobs in tow, right? But women, physically weaker sex, so you get the way female aggression is typically done is it's typically done as relational or reputational aggression, and it's typically paraded as moral concern or social concern. This is not aggression. This is just moral concern. This is not aggression. This is just social concern. And so, of course, that's where you get cancel culture, but it's also where you get people denying that there is cancel culture, because if they admit there is cancel culture, then they're admitting their own aggression. And women, for pretty obvious reasons, are very reluctant to admit their own aggression. So you get the situation where typically women are better than men at reading other people's emotions because they're the physically weaker sex with bubs in tow, and they really have to be able to read other people's emotions, and they're more likely to see the emotions as a threat because physically weaker sex with bubs in tow, right? But men are better at reading aggression because women won't admit their own aggression typically. So this affects how institutions work once they become feminized. But it also means that with shaming and shunning behavior, you can enforce a conformity on your networks that can actually, in one way it's corrosive, but another way can be very, very effective. There's a great essay from Ms. Magazine in 1976 called Trashing, the Dark Side of the Women's Movement, which is written by Joreen Freeman, where she talks about how rife shunning and shaming behavior is inside the women's movement. And my cynical view is the reason why there were so many lesbians so prominent in the women's movement was that they're the ones who were better at teamwork. You needed them in the women's movement to have an effective movement. Now, the disadvantage of that is lesbians don't have much inherent interest in productive relationships with men.
Hmm.
So relying on the lesbians who are better at teamwork to be the structure of your movement creates problems. And then that's actually affected the way feminism works, because it's not remotely true that all feminists are lesbian. That's not even close to true. But lesbians were disproportionately important in organising the movement, and to some degree, disproportionately important in creating the modern ideology. The Gail Rubins and Judith Butlers of the world. And yeah, you can see how, if you're a bit of a butch lesbian, you're going to be a bit alienated from the expectations of society straight off. So you're going to have, you're going to be attracted to views which elevate yourself rather than put you off in this weird thing in the corner, which nobody wants to be in the weird group in the corner. And any outlook which says, no, actually, this gives you a terrific advantage in understanding the world is going to be very, very attractive. So for all these reasons, you can get a situation where people are actually not very representative of a large number of people, but if they're particularly good at networking and particularly good at enforcing conformity within their networking and particularly good at punishing people who speak out, then you can be very effective. There's a great Taleb essay called The Power of an Intolerant Minority, which is on Medium. It's also it became a chapter in one of his books. And he talks about how you have a group which will, just will not bend and will just push and push and push and push and push. They can have a wildly disproportionate effect, particularly in a situation where most people just want to get on in their lives and they can't be bothered. And if they have to deal with this, it's unpleasant. So they just put their heads down and get on with it. Then you can have relatively small networks be wildly disproportionately effective.
Yes, I remember reading, I don't think it was that essay, but it was certainly in one of Taleb's books, and he used the example that you really only need about 5% of people to be intolerant and intransigent. They're not going to shift. What they say goes, and you're not going to bend them, and they can bend the whole society that way. And he used the example of, at the time, less than 5% of the UK population was Muslim, but where there were lots of Muslims, it was typically a higher percentage than that, and that changed the food industry. So there would be halal meat being the primary meat type, for example, in something like a Subway chain restaurant in the UK, because it was just the easiest way to go about things without getting complaints, whereas everyone else didn't pay it any mind. And the network effect is interesting. There's so much in there that's interesting, but sticking with the network effects for a moment, does this imply that almost the only way that you could ever get any balance against or to try and push the tide back in any one direction, whoever it is that's the intransigent group, is for another intransigent group to pop up with their own sets of demands and ideals, and the network effects ripple the other way? Or does that kind of what would typically be called the silent majority, but they kind of let things slide a little bit. They're a bit annoyed by it. They wish it didn't happen, but they're not going to put their heads above the parapet. The numbers haven't end up counting for anything in the end, the ratios, as people are calling it.
Well, yes. That's the interesting question about mobilization. If you have two very committed networks, but one is pushing stuff that the big majority of people agree with, they have an obvious and huge advantage. And to take an example, I used the example of the Bolsheviks earlier. Yes, they're only a small group. However, and it's a very big however, the election for the Constituent Assembly in late 1917, early 1918, the only truly democratic election in Russian history, about 80% of the voters voted for some form of socialism. So the Bolsheviks were pushing, we are the best socialists. So even though they did horrible things and generated a lot of opposition, they were nevertheless pushing in a direction where a lot of people bought onto them. Right? I mean, one of the reasons why the whites lost is, apart from not being as well coordinated, big reason why they lost is they were pushing against general views rather than with them. The Bolshevik advantage was they were ruthless, they were coordinated, and they were pushing with general views, not against them. Right. So if you possibly don't need quite as ruthlessly intransigent a group on the other side, but you do need a sufficiently committed group that will just say no, 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 and can be effective at mobilizing popular opinion on their favor. So if you can turn it into a clear electoral issue and then mean it, then you do have a big advantage. Now, the Tories are in the process of destroying themselves because they won an issue where they were speaking for the majority, which is have control over migration. And they've completely and utterly betrayed their voters on this point.
Yeah.
To a level which is just stunning. I mean, from the opposite side of the world, I can see that they're destroying themselves because they didn't keep faith with their voters on this very obvious issue. But still they don't. I mean, still the betrayal continues, right? They can't organize themselves to do anything effective, which leads to the suspicion that they don't actually want to do anything about it. Yeah, and then certainly they haven't been able to grapple with doing things with the civil service to make it actually bend to their will, which suggests, given the way the British system works, if you want to bend the public service in that country to your will, you can, because there's almost no constitutional limit to what you can pass as legislation. And you can certainly do what I would thought it was the blindingly obvious thing, which is set up a separate Department of Education committed to border control, which is what we have in Australia, for example, rather than having the Home Office, which obviously doesn't believe in stopping migration and is obviously a severely dysfunctional institution, leaving it in charge. I mean, it's just idiocy. But the suspicion is they don't care.